Hello, my name is Bob Arum, and you're listening to Walking the Floor.
I'm walking the floor over you.
Walking the floor.
I'm walking the floor. Walking the floor over you.
Hola, senors and senoritas. This is Chris Shiflett. And you are listening to Walking the Floor. I'm just sitting here at Walking the Floor World Headquarters, getting ready to leave tomorrow for tour, back out on the road, kicking it off in Fresno, Rock City. Should be a good weekend. Looking forward to it. By the way, speaking of NorCal, gotta let you know that I had to bow out of the Cast Hope benefit gig up in Sacramento, because we're actually playing Saturday Night Live that same night, which is great, but sad that I couldn't make it up there and do the gig. But the gig is still happening. Chuck Reagan and Dave House are still playing, and you should definitely still get out there and support a good cause. It's gonna be a good night. I wish when I was in Sacramento this weekend I could just go over there and like pre-tape my set, but it's not to be. It's not to be. You know, don't let me forget, the vinyl release of West Coast Town pre-order is available now through Rusted Wave Records and Side One Dummy Records. If you go to my website, chrisshiflettmusic.com, you can pre-order it and get it. It's going to be awesome. 12 inches of beautiful vinyl. And while you're at it, make sure you sign up for the Walking the Floor playlist on the Spotify. 1,400 plus followers and growing. Well on our way to over 500,000 subscribers, which is the target goal, as you know. So at this rate, it should be around like, you know, the end of the next century. We should get there, and when we do, we're gonna take over Spotify. Okay, now today's episode is a little bit of a departure from the country Americana type guests I usually interview, to another one of my passions, which is boxing. You probably know I am a huge boxing fan, so of course I jumped at the opportunity to sit and chat with Top Rank Boxing's head honcho, Bob Arum, at his house over there in Beverly Hills. Got to sit down with him a couple of weeks ago. He's been out on the promo circuit, hyping the fight he's got coming up between one of his top guys, Vasyl Lomachenko, and Guillermo Rigondeaux. That's going to be on December 9th on ESPN, out there at Madison Square Garden. Did I tell you, for free on ESPN? But before we get to that, I actually got to go up to Lomachenko's media workout the other day in Oxnard, and I got to sit with him and ask him a couple of questions. His English is much better than my Ukrainian, I have to say, much better. You know, unfortunately, after I talked to him, I watched this clip of him kicking a goal, soccer ball, into a goal in his driveway that I saw on Twitter, and I didn't know he played soccer, so you know I didn't get to ask him about that. But maybe someday we'll get to enlist him in our traveling pickup game, because he looked like he had some skills. All right, here's Vasyl Lomachenko, briefly on Walking the Floor. Feel last week heading into the fight? Are you anxious to just have the fight be here?
I feel good. I feel great. It's 1.5 week and before the fight, so everything good.
Are you comfortable fighting that Cuban style from your years, all your years as an amateur?
I fight a couple fighters from Cuba. Always Cuban style, and Cuban fighters was a very strong and smart guys. He has a very good tradition, boxing tradition.
With Rigondeaux, how are you going to impose yourself on him?
So December night, I try to show my best skill and my best style. Anyway.
I think the real question that I'm trying to ask is: Are you going to put him out of business so us fight fans don't have to watch him fight anymore?
You know, his возраст.
Age.
his age move his business from business.
So do you live here in Oxnard?
Just then I prepared to the fight. Yes, okay. I come to United States. I come to this gym and.
You like it here?
Yeah, of course.
Southern California. I grew up not too far from here. Awesome, man. I'll let you get to it. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, that was Vasyl Lomachenko, the WBO super featherweight champion of the world. I bet when he needs a new pair of strings or like, some new picks or something, I bet Vasyl Lomachenko gets on over to Zounds.com to buy it, because Zounds.com has the best deals. And at Zounds, you never have to pay full price all at once. You can split your order total over 4, 6, 8, or 12 monthly payments. Come on, man. Get over to Zounds.com. All right, let's talk to Bob Arum. Okay, for those of you who aren't boxing fans, let me tell you, Bob Arum is one of the most legendary promoters out there. He's a true blue icon of the sport of boxing, whose career dates all the way back to 1966, when he put on his first fight, Ali versus Chuvalo, up in Toronto. After that fight got kicked all over from town to town, nobody wanted to touch it, and he finally made it happen, which is a totally crazy story that he tells later on in this interview. And he has been a nonstop presence in the sport ever since. Here's a few other names, besides Muhammad Ali, that you might know that his company, Top Rank Boxing, has promoted over the years. Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Tommy the Hitman Hearns, Roberto Duran, Oscar De La Hoya, Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, and the list goes on and on and on. And he continues still to develop top-level talent like current champion Terrence Crawford and, of course, Vasyl Lomachenko, who's fighting on December 9th on ESPN for free. Make sure you tune in. Mr. Arum was incredibly generous with his time, and we covered a lot of ground. Now, some people love him, and some people don't. I'm talking to you, Don King. But I thought he was fantastic. This is Bob Arum on Walking the Floor.
Vasyl Lomachenko is one of the favorite fighters that I've promoted in the 52 years I've been at this. He's an extremely competent fighter, technically superb, very entertaining. I am really looking forward to this battle that he'll be having with Rigondeaux, because Rigo is a tremendous fighter in his own right. Here are the two best amateurs of our time, each of whom have won 2 Olympic gold medals and have done splendidly in the professional ranks. This is a fight for history. I mean, really, when people talk about the great events and the great fights, which we've had many in boxing, right up among those, people will be mentioning this fight between Vasyl Lomachenko and Rigondeaux.
Do you think, why put Lomachenko in there with Rigondeaux now? It seems to me, as a fight fan, that's a high-risk, low-reward kind of fight. Rigondeaux is a guy that people don't really care about or like, because he's kind of regarded as a very boring, a talented, boring fighter, kind of like the classic Cuban, comes out of the amateur program with all the skills in the world, but watching his fights is he never caught on. He kind of had his moment, but it never happened.
Rigo fights the difference between the two guys. Rigo fights the Cuban style,
right,
which is get ahead on points and then coast and win.
Right. Not a fan-friendly style.
Exactly right, because he comes from a communist country. It wasn't a question of being fan-friendly. It was a question of piling up enough points and winning.
Right.
You watch the Cubans now, even to this day, when they fight in the amateurs and the Olympics, it's the same thing. They go all out for a couple of rounds, looking to pile up the points, and then they stink it out for the rest of the fight, and they win a decision. Well, that's his style. That's what he's learned. Now, the difference between him and Lomachenko is Lomachenko has all the skills in the world and piles up points, but he's always looking for how he can destroy his opponent.
Sure.
In other words, Lomachenko knows that he's piled up enough points he could coast in the fight and win. He doesn't want to do it because from the opening round, when he feels out his opponent, it's always with the idea that he's going to either destroy the guy or make him quit.
Sure.
Different mentality.
Totally different mentality. And Lomachenko, to me, is like the perfect antidote coming out of the Floyd Mayweather era, when you have not just the most popular boxer of his time, fighting in that boring style, but you have all these other guys, Andre Ward, Erislandy Lara, there's a, the list goes on and on of guys that are highly skilled but don't fight in a fan-friendly manner.
Right.
And to me, Lomachenko is a guy who defies all that. He's got all those skills, and yet he's explosive and super fan-friendly and entertaining. So I guess my question is, why put him in there with a guy that he runs the risk of losing to, at this point in his career, when you're trying to develop him into that next superstar fighter?
Because Lomachenko is over and above anything else an entertainer. And he's been pressing me for this fight because he knows the historic importance of this fight. And he has such confidence in his ability that I could put him in with Anthony Joshua and he would take the fight.
So kind of like when Canelo forced his team to put him in there with Lara and Trout and some of those guys.
Right, which was stupid fights for him to take at that point because they were
boring.
They would, and dangerous.
Right, boring and dangerous. That's exactly right.
Right, but
So Lomachenko he's not concerned about a boring or dangerous fight?
Well, he knows it won't be boring because he won't allow it to be boring.
Right.
And the more dangerous it is, the more he likes it.
How do you see this fight going? What do you think happens?
I think I look for Lomachenko to knock Rigondeaux out or stop him, make him quit. 9th, 10th round, something like that. Rigondeaux's a tremendous fighter, but Lomachenko's the best fighter I've seen. You know what's interesting about Rigondeaux, though? I was looking at his fight record yesterday. He hasn't fought anybody. He's fought a couple of guys. But his fight record is not, it's like a long list of nobodies. Well, yeah. Whereas Lomachenko went in tough right from the very beginning and has fought only the top level opposition. Because that's Lomachenko's psyche. He wants only the top. When I tell him, Lomo, the best guy I could get for you, and I give him the name, I don't want to embarrass anybody, and he says, no, he says, I mean, that's not a real fight. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, he can't be even remotely competitive with me. So I have to force him into a fight where other fighters would be salivating because it's a good paycheck without risk. No, he wants Nicholas Walters, the toughest guys he wants. That's his mentality, and that's his father's mentality. They want challenges, right? And they really. The Nicholas Walters fight might be my favorite one of his fights. He just completely took everything from that guy. And who knew that? Walters is a hell of a fighter. Yeah. And Lomachenko played with him and made him quit. Yeah. And if he hadn't have quit, he would have knocked him out. So Lomo is really something special, something we really haven't seen before. Do you think you can develop him into being a Pacquiao-sized superstar? Bearing in mind the sort of current Red Scare climate that exists in this country right now? Well, first of all... Is that an obstacle? First of all, remember, we have to be a little bit more sophisticated by saying Red Scare. The Soviet Union is over. Right. We have to be careful about the Russians, although our president seems to embrace them. but Lomachenko is Ukrainian.
Sure.
And that's a real difference.
Oh, I know. I understand that, but do you think that the masses of boxing public are going to make that distinction easily?
Well, the Loma Rigo fight sold out in 3 days at the theater in Madison Square Garden. And Joel Fisher, who runs events at the Garden, told me that the next time we bring Loma back to New York, it has to be in the big building because Lomachenko will easily sell it out. And
is it in the theater?
Not just the theater, because the reason he says that is that since we've announced the sellout, they get about 50 to 60 calls every day basically from Ukrainians who live in Brooklyn and other places in New York, looking to buy tickets to the fight. And when Klitschko, who was the last terrific Ukrainian fighter to fight in the Garden, they came close to a sellout. And Lomachenko will do the same, maybe more. And I think with the platform we now have at ESPN, where a lot of their programming will be devoted to boxing, a lot of their they have great like First Take and Mike in the morning. They're beginning to talk more and more about boxing and more about Lomachenko. And before you know it, I think he can be an icon. I mean, Golovkin became pretty well known and was able to sell out or come close to selling out the Garden. And Lomachenko, I think, will exceed that. And the reason for that is Golovkin struggled with English, and to this day he really isn't articulate in English. And Lomachenko was so damn smart that when I told him about 9 months ago to be serious and study English, he came back 3 months later fluent in English.
Really?
He's an amazing guy.
What do you do with a guy like that to develop him for that kind of crossover stardom? How involved as his promoter do you get?
Well, we're very involved. And with the microphone, see, when we were fighting on HBO, it was different because HBO is a premium television network, and so much of their program, most of their program, obviously, is devoted to entertainment, movies, television shows. I mean, good stuff, but they are not a sports network. Neither is Showtime. And ESPN is sports and only sports. And they can devote a lot of time to building up and talking about a fighter like Lomachenko. So I think with this ESPN platform, Lomachenko will become a huge star in the United States. And he's already internationally extraordinarily popular. I'm getting premium prices from foreign broadcasters for the television rights to his fights.
Well, who else in your stable are your next up and coming superstars? Who do you got? Lomachenko, Crawford, Ramirez, another one.
Lomachenko and Crawford are the top two, the most advanced. Terrence is a terrific fighter, a nice young man, has a big following in Omaha, Nebraska.
And you've actually worked him as a local attraction there, which is kind of odd nowadays.
We work every fighter that we can as a local attraction. You can't work Lomachenko as a local attraction,
right?
Really, because he comes from Odessa in the Ukraine.
But in this modern era, when fighters don't have to sell tickets because of the casino fees and the networks and all that stuff, that is kind of an anomaly nowadays.
No,
isn't it?
Because you can't. If a kid comes from New York or he comes from LA, where there are a lot of fighters, a lot of interest, and so forth, it's hard to develop him as a local attraction. If a kid comes from Omaha, Nebraska, and he's a terrific fighter, it's much easier. And as we're demonstrating with Jose Ramirez in Fresno, we sold 14,000 tickets to his last fight.
That's incredible.
That's incredible.
And not easy to do.
Well, but he comes from that area, and he's been a spokesperson for water rights and for immigration reform, stuff that the people are really interested in. And he's been a spokesperson for them, and so he's extraordinarily popular. It was the same years ago. In other words, we could take a Marvin Hagler, who came from New England, and we developed him as a New England attraction. So when he fought in Las Vegas, 5,000-6,000 people would come from the Boston area to watch him fight. Tommy Hearns was similar in the sense that he brought thousands of people from Detroit area.
Sure.
So it is possible. It is tough with fighters from metropolitan, areas like Los Angeles, where there's so many fighters, also from New York. And then if you get fighters from areas where the people have no interest in boxing, where boxing really doesn't register, they have to fight away, the way fights, and it's hard to develop.
Are there places like that where is boxing regional in that sense? Well,
a southern kid from Alabama or Mississippi, very, very tough to make him a local attraction. Because there's no background there. For years, these people haven't really followed boxing.
Right.
We're seeing strange things now because we're analyzing the ratings, that the leading market based on percentages of people watching in an area, our leading market, fight in, fight out, is New Orleans. Now, why is that? We don't know. We're trying to figure it out. But we're certainly going to look to bring an event to New Orleans next year.
How do you take a guy like Crawford that can sell out an arena in his hometown and turn him into a De La Hoya, a Pacquiao, like that kind of superstar crossover level?
Again, they're all different.
Right.
But
he's an exciting fighter, fan-friendly style. He's super talented.
I understand.
Great grassroots
but
draw.
There's a difference to how you market a Hispanic fighter like a De La Hoya. And remember, with De La Hoya, we didn't set any records fighting him in Los Angeles. It was only when we moved him to Las Vegas and to Texas that we got a lot of traction. But you market a Hispanic fighter different from the way you market an African-American fighter. Now, the big thing with Crawford, we realized, was to build up this audience in Nebraska for him. That wasn't as hard as it sounds because we weren't competing with any professional sports team in the league. They don't have an NBA team.
Right.
They don't have an NFL team. They root for Green Bay Packers, but that's in Wisconsin.
So he's their sports franchise of the moment.
So we built him up as a Nebraska franchise. And we were able to fill the CenturyLink in Omaha. And more than that, we got people really invested in him, so that when we brought him to New York or to Las Vegas to fight, thousands of people came from Nebraska to follow him, just the way thousands of fans, when Nebraska football team, the college team, is on the road, thousands of people follow the team when they're playing away from home.
How big do you see, and I don't mean as far as a draw, but with a guy like Crawford, how physically, how much bigger, how much will he move up through the weight divisions? Is he already moving to 147 next? Is he leaving 140?
Yeah, his next fight will be against the winner of Horn Corcoran, which fight takes place December 13th in Brisbane. He's going to go over there with me for that fight right after the Loma Rigondeaux fight.
Do you promote Horn as well?
Who?
Horn? Jeff
Yes.
Horn? You're okay.
Yeah, we when he fought Pacquiao, we have options with a company called Duco Events, which is a New Zealand Australian company.
Right. Fighters moving up through the weight classes to chase bigger name fighters and more money is like, it's a classic thing. Sometimes it works really well, a la Pacquiao, and sometimes it doesn't work well at all, and guys move up into territory that they physically shouldn't be in and can't really compete at. How do you sort of, counsel your fighters?
Well, Terrence wouldn't move up just for bigger paydays. Terrence is moving up because as a fighter gets older, it becomes more and more difficult to make weight, which is the day before the fight. He struggled in his last fight against Ndango, making the weight, but not. He had no trouble obviously with Ndango, but he told me that he feels more comfortable fighting at 147, just the way when he was tremendous at 135, winning the title, going over to England and winning the title. He told me that he didn't want to struggle to make 135 anymore, wanted to go up to 140. So I don't really see him going to 154. There are a lot of good fights for him at 147. And for a while, for the next 2-3 years, not going to have trouble making that weight.
And what about Lomachenko? Where do you think he'll wind up physically?
Lomachenko probably, he's such a talent. He's already talking to me about going to 135. And before long, I assume he'll be at 140.
I mean, to me, Nonito Donaire is a classic example of somebody that flew a little too close to the sun in that regard, with going higher and higher to where he just wasn't at the weight class that made any sense for him anymore, to my mind.
Well, that's true. He had a great advantage because he was a big kid.
Yeah.
Nonito is a terrific fighter, and he felt he had to go up in weight because he was having difficulty making the lower weight. I think he started at 115, and before you knew it, he was at 126. Well, 11 pounds doesn't seem like a lot.
It's huge at that level.
But as a percentage, of the weight, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's not gigantic when it's a super middleweight going to light heavy. But yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, do you have any regrets looking back now? And I realize Pacquiao's not retired or anything yet, but do you have any regrets with him moving up into weight classes that he maybe shouldn't have been or wasn't at his best in? When you look at back on his career and he was just knocking people out, destroying people at 126 and even like 130 in those weight classes, and then by the time he gets into 147, he's fighting those really big guys and fighting guys like Antonio Margarito. Those are big spectacle fights, but they're not, they don't carry the same sort of impact on his legacy as some of the earlier stuff.
Well, you have to understand, he was bitching and moaning when he was at 140 because he liked to eat, and then he says, I want to go to 147 so I won't have any difficulty making weight, which meant that he was eating like 8,000 calories a day because he was burning off the weight just to keep him midway at 144.
Right.
So I always felt that he could fight at 140, but he didn't really want to make the effort. You understand?
Yeah.
And maybe he knew his body better than I did, probably did, because he figured that it was easier to consume a lot of calories and burn off the weight, not worried about making weight, rather than deprive himself of caloric input and therefore maybe weaken himself when he was training. So I never argue with these kids.
Well, do you get involved though with, who they pick as their trainer, who they have on their team for strength and conditioning guys, all that sort of stuff? I mean, there's so much out there nowadays. It's changed so much in boxing in, say, the last 10, 20 years with everybody having a strength and conditioning guy and the influx of the PEDs and all that stuff that's been a huge issue for the sport of boxing. Are you actively involved in the guys that you promote in terms of picking their teams?
No, we don't pick the teams at all. I mean, a lot of them come to us and they tell us that maybe dissatisfied with the trainer, could we recommend somebody else? But we don't interfere with that. If a kid wants to pick a trainer, even though we feel that the trainer isn't really getting the best out of the kid, we stay out of it, because boxing is such a mind game. And sometimes if you feel you're doing good by having the kid make a change, it doesn't work because he doesn't connect with the new trainer. And instead of getting better, he gets worse.
Right.
So we really stay out of it until we're asked. And then when we're asked, I have people in my organization who know a lot more than I do, technically, like my matchmakers, Bruce Trampler and Brad Goodman and Carl Moretti, and I have them talk to the fighter and the manager, and I pretty much stay out of it.
Let's back up a little bit and talk about how you first got into boxing. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your life before boxing. I know you grew up in Brooklyn, and you're a New York native, and had a career as a lawyer.
Yeah, I was an assistant United States attorney during the Kennedy administration in the Southern District under Bob Morgenthau was the U.S. attorney, and Robert Kennedy was the attorney general. And I was the head of the tax section in the office and handled a lot of major tax cases. And one of the cases that I took on was the seizure of funds from the first Patterson-Liston fight in 1961. And I really learned about the business of boxing from handling that case, because I had absolutely no interest in boxing. I had never seen a boxing match.
You weren't a fight fan at that
No,
point.
not at all. Not at all. Everybody, from Brooklyn was a Dodger fan, baseball, and we played a lot of basketball. It was a big game. And baseball, I played a lot of baseball, but I never watched a boxing match. And most of the boxing matches were on Friday night fights.
Sure.
I came from a Orthodox Jewish home, and so we didn't have the television on Friday nights, so I never saw a boxing match.
So boxing was never an option growing up. That's
No,
funny.
never an option. I never, I didn't dislike it, obviously. I remember as a kid listening sometimes on the radio when Joe Louis fought, because Joe Louis was a big hero, particularly after he knocked out Max Schmeling. So we would always listen to a Joe Louis fight on the radio.
Well, what was it that you learned from looking at it from the viewpoint of a tax lawyer? What did you learn about the business of boxing that made you think, "Oh, I could do that better than those guys"?
Well, first of all, I realized that there was a lot of money in the sport because it was the beginning of closed-circuit television. And it was a little misleading. I misled myself in the sense that, we used to have exhibitors and they put up guarantees and they were supposed to give you 50% of the revenue after the guarantee. And, they would all cheat. But that night of the Patterson-Liston fight, we had our internal revenue officer in every box office of the country. And we finally got a legitimate count, and the numbers were staggering for the
Really?
time. Yeah.
And that was enough to lure you out of a successful career as a lawyer?
No, I had no intention of doing anything in boxing. But when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1965, I went with a firm in New York, and a company that was distributing boxing on closed circuit retained me in the firm, and in that role, I met Jim Brown, the football player.
Oh, right.
And Brown introduced me to Muhammad Ali. And
that was your first fight, wasn't it? Ali Shavala, right?
Well, it was supposed to be Ali and Terrell, but that's when Ali said he had nothing against the Viet Cong, and they threw us out of Chicago. We ended up in Toronto, and Terrell pulled out, and Shavala stepped in, and that was my first fight. It was 51 years ago in March of this year.
Why would Ali, who was already heavyweight champion at that point, an established superstar, take a risk on a first-time promoter?
Well, you have to understand that the guy who was promoting Ali at the time, because he had ties with Liston, was a lawyer named Roy Cohn, who was one of the most thieving MFs that you could imagine. So Ali was being promoted by a den of thieves. Roy Cohn, by the way, was became the mentor for Donald Trump, who is now president of the United States. So I can tell you, watching Trump talk extemporaneously, what he's going to say, because he's a clone of that creep Roy Cohn. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I go back in New York with all of those guys. So anyway, I had learned about the business of boxing. I had taken a deposition for 10 days of Roy Cohn, and I debriefed him of everything. I mean, he was a clever guy, but I learned about the business. So when Jim introduced me to Ali and to his then advisor, later manager, Herbert Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad's son, they knew what I was talking about, and they weren't taking a chance on a new promoter because fight was going to be in Chicago, and so I hired the local promoter, Irving Schoenwald, in Chicago to sell tickets and so forth. And I was the promoter, but really the business manager for the whole thing. Sure. So, I mean, that's how it started, and that's how I started. And I was just going to do it for one fight, just to get for sort of kicks. And I ran into this whole political storm, which I really didn't imagine.
And then that fight kind of got kicked around from city to city for a while.
Well, we ended up in Toronto. We got thrown out of Chicago. Every other city in the United States put out statements that they wouldn't do the fight. Went up to Montreal. They agreed to do it. And then the American Legion threatened the mayor of Montreal that the American Legion was going to organize a boycott of the World's Fair in Montreal the next year. So they pulled out. And then Harold Ballard, who was a co-owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the hockey team, and the Maple Leaf Gardens, told me to come to Toronto and he would put it on. And he ran into problems because his partner, Connie Smythe, said that if Harold allowed the draft dodger in the building, that it was going to be over Smythe's dead body. So Ballard, in 1 week, had to raise enough money from banks in Canada to buy out Smythe of the team and the arena in order to do the fight. And then people went to the Ontario Parliament, and they decided to take a vote whether to allow the fight at all.
Jesus.
And we won by 1 vote.
Oh my! Have you ever had to jump through those kind of hoops again? Was that like your first fight and the hardest fight you've ever had to promote?
Well, that's the point. When people say after a promotion, like Mayweather Pacquiao, was that the hardest promotion you ever did? I say no. The hardest promotion I ever did was the first one, which I managed to produce over all odds and without really any money other than a Diners Club card then. That was the toughest one.
And was it ultimately profitable?
We made enough money to pay off the expenses on the card, to pay Ali a little something, and to get out of Dodge hole, because it would have been a terrible, terrible blow to the civil rights movement if those bastards had stopped us from doing the fight.
Well, I'm glad you touched on that, because obviously that time was, you had the civil rights movement, you had the anti-war movement, you had Ali coming out against the war and just tangled up in all that stuff, and then you had his whole thing, his involvement with the Nation of Islam, that I understand you had to go talk to Elijah Muhammad when you first went to work with him and sort of get his blessing on the whole thing. I guess my question is, what was Ali? We know what Ali was like out in public, very outspoken on all those issues, right? But what was he like to deal with behind closed doors for you? I mean, here's a guy who's highly critical of the white power elite of that moment, and here you are.
See, that wasn't true.
Okay,
that wasn't true. Ali was highly critical of the way black people were treated in the United States.
I'm not taking the opposing viewpoint. I support what he said.
He was absolutely correct.
Right, of course he was. Of course he was.
Any animosity against white people because they were white.
Sure.
In other words...
But you know how it is when somebody's young and, in the middle of their thing. Like, I'm just curious if there was ever any tension dealing with him directly.
Ali was a showman.
Right.
So if you espouse those views that black people were being treated badly in the United States, which was absolutely correct.
Sure.
You can't expound those views if you're in the entertainment, sports business, on an intellectual basis. You have to do it in sound bites. Certainly now.
Well, we see that's still something happening.
And it was true then.
Right. So and it's still happening right now with all the NFL stuff.
So Ali's way of communicating with the public was obviously a lot different from his way of communicating in private, like people like me.
Right.
And so in private, I found him very intelligent, very insightful, without hate or malice in his heart. And that wasn't what some people saw from him when he was sounding his views in public. But you have to also realize that people in America weren't used to a black person of prominence stating things openly, which really, up to that point, were just said privately.
Sure. Can we talk about the ups and downs of your career through the 70s and 80s? Because I know there was a point where you sort of actively decided to not be involved with the heavyweight division anymore, even though that was sort of counter to the thought that the person that controls the heavyweight division controls boxing. But then you had tons of success with some of the smaller weight classes.
Well, after Ali stopped fighting, I had this heavyweight John Tate, who I put in a WBA tournament, which he won, and then he got knocked out by Mike Weaver. But again, for me, heavyweight boxing after Ali was disappointing. I mean, during the Ali day, it wasn't just Ali, but we had so many great fighters.
Sure.
Like Joe Frazier and
Ken Norton, Foreman, all those guys.
And Jimmy Young.
Jerry
and,
Quarry.
And Ernie Shea. I mean, the list went on and on and on. I mean, to be in the top 10 of the heavyweights was really something. And people say, well, what happened? Well, what happened was this. When I first started with Ali, a lineman in the NFL was making $5,000 a season. And he was doing it only because he could get a job in, whether it was in as a stockbroker or as a car salesman, after the season was over. So he was using the football to become, his name to become known, to get a real job in the off season.
Really?
Yeah, right. 5,000. You couldn't, even then you couldn't support yourself on 5,000.
Yeah.
Okay. So that big guys, particularly big African American guys, would look to boxing as a means to make a lot of money and become very prominent. But over the years, as the NFL prospered, as basketball, professional basketball became prominent, big, strong, athletic guys who might go into the heavyweight division and become top heavyweights or contenders were on the football field or on the basketball court. So talented people were lost to boxing. I always told everybody that if Ali had come along now, he would probably be a tight end for a high school team and then maybe in college. That he wouldn't go into a smelly gym and work hard and train hard,
sure,
without people seeing him, with the hopes to become a heavyweight boxer. So the fact that we have any Americans in the heavyweight division is almost like a miracle to me. Now you have, you see what happened. Where did the heavyweights come from now? Well, they came for a while from Eastern Europe. Why? Because in Eastern Europe, yeah, there's some basketball, but most heavyweights, you know,
because guys that weigh 250 pounds can't play soccer,
and they're too big for soccer.
Right,
too big for soccer, and there's no NFL. Now, why do we have African black guys in England being so good, like Anthony Joshua?
Sure.
Because Joshua never thought to become an American football player. And you have to say, when you say football, you have to put American football. Right. So, I mean, where is a big guy, big, strong guy like that going to excel in sports? I mean, he's too big to be a soccer player. Right. So, therefore, you're getting heavyweights now, pretty good heavyweights, from around the world, like Joseph Parker in New Zealand.
Sure.
Right. But you're not getting him from America because LeBron James is playing for the Cavaliers and I mean, some of these brutes that play in the NFL are making a lot of money.
What are some of the ways that it's stayed the same? And you kind of touched on this earlier in terms of promoting a fight and a fighter. But what are some of the biggest differences in promoting, say, in the 60s and 70s to now, where you have, satellite TV and people watching sports on their phones and social media and all this, in terms of getting the promotion out there?
Well, when I first started with Ali Shavallo, there were no satellites, no international satellites, certainly no domestic satellites. And the signal was transmitted by telephone company long lines to different outlets in different cities, so we could do it on closed circuit. And then I remember we had a line that went to a studio in New York where they made a tape, a kinescope, we called it then, of the fight, and we would rush it to the last plane leaving New York to go to England, because if we made that plane, we would say get 50,000, and if we missed it, it would go down to 25, because if we made the plane, they could see the fight in the UK the next night.
Right.
And if we missed the plane, it was 2 nights.
Yeah. I mean, how different is it in terms of, I know in the past, boxing was maybe not a mainstream sport in the sense that like baseball or something is, but it was certainly more mainstream. And if you go back far enough, it was absolutely mainstream. It was one of the most popular sports. But say in the 60s and 70s, when it was a little, people paid a little closer attention to it, but newspapers had boxing writers. It was more a part of the sort of fabric of sports culture here in this country. But do you think that nowadays, with all the ways that people can access it, is it more widely viewed now or less?
Well,
what's your sense
I
of
think
that?
That's the wrong question. The question is, why did boxing go from being such a mainstream sport? Now, like people say, well, Ali, they covered him from newspapers all over the country. Well, firstly, the newspapers don't exist anymore.
Right.
It's very hard. People don't get the news that way from the papers, pretty much. So you don't have boxing writers in newspapers. You have, of course, more information coming out and more access to information because of the internet. But anyway, people followed boxing because of Ali into the 70s, the late 70s. Now, boxing continued on because a guy picked up the baton, and that was Sugar Ray Leonard.
Sure.
Sugar Ray Leonard and the great Olympic team that we had in 1976 that won all the medals in Montreal, beating Cubans. And in those days, they didn't wear headgear.
Sure.
They were Spinks brothers, Howard Davis.
But then you also had, Hearns and Hagler and Roberto Duran, all those guys.
But the linchpin was Leonard.
Right.
Leonard and Howard Cosell. ABC was doing the Olympics in those days, and they did a much better job than NBC does today, much better. And they made they made stars out of the performers, and Sugar Ray Leonard became a star.
Sure.
So then you went.
So he was a star before he even turned pro, basically.
Well, because in those days the television showed the amateur boxing team facing other countries and so forth. It was different. And boxing throughout the rest of the 70s and the 80s was a mainstream sport. I mean, we had the satellites domestic satellites came in. We could distribute it more. The amounts were enormous for those times, from the Hagler fights, the Hearns fights, the Leonard fights, Duran fight, that group of people. It was absolutely tremendous, and it was a bonanza.
But even, I guess what I'm getting at is, like, even with something as big, financially big as, say, the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, were there actually more people watching Sugar Ray Leonard versus Roberto Duran, or the No Mas fight, stuff like that.
Way more people.
Okay.
Now, what happened? What happened? Now, when I go back and I analyze what happened, I came finally to the conclusion. It was my fault, and it was the fault of the other promoters that we were not looking for the long play, that we went for the money. How did we go for the money? When HBO came knocking and paid us 3 times what an ABC paid us and let us go on a Saturday night rather than a Saturday afternoon, we all ate that candy. We all went on drugs.
I thought it was that the networks stopped showing boxing. So you're saying it was the other way around.
Only because the networks were then put in a position where they were developing fighters to then be shown only on the premium networks, HBO and Showtime. And once that happened, there was
You heard it here first, folks. HBO killed boxing. Bob Arum said it. It's a scoop.
Well, I mean, HBO didn't kill boxing. HBO looked for a product that was good to put on their network. That's their business.
Sure.
We killed boxing by becoming addicted to the drug. The drug was money. And we then killed boxing because we had a smaller and smaller audience. We had an audience that not the 100 million homes that watch television, that it was 20 million, 25 million homes. And it was, that doesn't even tell the story. Let me tell you the whole story.
Sure.
Because then people started saying, well, boxing is old-fashioned. It only appeals to an older audience. And they would look at a demographic of the people watching boxing on an HBO or Showtime, and they would see that it skews older. So they jumped to the conclusion that boxing skews only to an older audience. But there was a fallacy there. It was true. The numbers don't lie. And once we brought big-time boxing this year back to ESPN, we saw a remarkably different story. Suddenly, we're skewing young. Why? Because if you want to watch HBO, you got to pay a monthly fee to watch HBO. You don't have to pay a monthly fee to watch a fight on ESPN. It's free. So we get them, and a lot of the kids have cut the cord on the channel, but they get the slim packages.
Sure. Well, it's interesting though, because you see some attempts to bring boxing back to, say, network television. The
boxing
big one to me
is back.
Well, yeah, but the big one to me in recent years is Premier Boxing Champions. You know, your pal,
again, they did it.
Al Heyman.
Al had the right idea, but he did it wrong.
He did it terribly.
Yes, but again.
I mean, if you put bad fights on network TV, no one's going to watch them.
No, that's not true.
That is absolutely true.
He
started out with some good matchups, and then because of this nonsense about how they only fight guys within their stable, that dried up pretty quick.
It's not the matchup.
I think the matchup's a big part of it, you don't think?
No, it's how it's promoted. Look what happened on last Saturday.
He put it too much on TV. I can't even keep track of it. And I'm a huge boxing fan.
Listen, you're generalizing. I go by the number. Last Saturday, we had a fight show on ESPN. We had a guy named Bidarov who won the title, of a big Chechnya guy.
Yeah. I watched it.
Yeah, but most people hadn't heard of him. And Jose Ramirez fighting a good guy, Reed. Most people hadn't heard of Jose, but it was promoted on ESPN, and almost 2 million people watched it. But that's not the whole story. What's the story? It was up against UFC, which has been talking about, hey, boxing is old, we're young. Now, not only did we beat UFC by the number of people watching our fight as against their show, again, free television against free television, but we beat them decisively on 18-35 and 18-49. We beat them on all levels.
Is that the coveted slice?
Yeah, that's the coveted slice that all the advertisers are looking
Well,
at.
I thought ESPN did a fantastic job, and I just watched the fight. I didn't watch the lead up in the Biberov fight, but with Ramirez, they did a great job of telling his story. You know, those little vignettes.
Again, because they're a sports network that has time, right? They're not HBO that really uses boxing to please a small segment of their viewers and as part of an overall excellent entertainment package.
Right.
Same thing for Showtime.
Right.
Nothing against them. Nothing against them, but if boxing is to survive, it's going to survive with an ESPN, with a megaphone that enables young people and people of all kind of ethnic backgrounds. Our diversity numbers are through the ceiling. Our Spanish numbers, our African American numbers are great. What's happening now is something that people only dreamt about. The fact that boxing is inherently a popular sport and is in the DNA of the American people.
I mean, is you talked about your own responsibility along with other promoters of taking the money from the premium networks and that being part of the responsibility of the diminishing popularity for a time of boxing. But is righting that wrong part of what motivates you to stay in the sport now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not making myself altruistic that I'm in there to right or wrong. I realized that it was the wrong thing for the sport and economically wrong.
Right.
That it was short-sighted. And so we realized that by aligning ourselves with this deal with ESPN, we were going to right the ship.
I'd say taking the short money is a problem that that afflicts most of modern capitalism, if you ask me. But
again, also, it's not necessarily the fault of the promoter. The promoter should have been strong enough to resist it, but we weren't, because we had pressure too from our fighters.
Sure.
I mean, how could you tell Marvin Hagler that you're going to pay him $300,000 because that's what ABC was going to pay you for a fight, when he could make $700,000, $800,000 fighting on HBO? How could you tell him to turn it down? Because unlike a promoter who hopefully has a long lifespan, in the sport, athletes die young.
Yeah,
they have a limited number of years that they can perform, and of course they want to make the most possible money.
Okay, you mentioned UFC a minute ago, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because to me the UFC versus boxing debate is kind of a fallacy. I personally don't know a lot of people that follow both or even interested in both. I think it kind of reaches I think they're different audiences. So although I get it that they're both combat sports and there are some similarities, I don't see them as necessarily even being in competition with each other. What's your take on that?
Well, our research shows that there's very little crossover.
Really? So you have actual science on that?
Yeah, there's very little crossover.
Okay, I just base that on the fact that none of my boxing friends follow UFC and vice versa.
That's because our numbers show that the crossover is about 7%.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, very that low. That 7% of the people are interested in both sports. So it's very, very hard, for example, in the Hispanic community to find many people who care about it. In the black community, African American, it's overwhelming boxing. With the white young people, it's a little bit the other way. it's probably an advantage to UFC. And the reason for that, we're beginning to find out, is that we were dummies, that these white young people either couldn't afford or they didn't feel it was worth it to pay money to HBO or Showtime every month to watch stuff that they weren't particularly interested in, like maybe Games of Thrones or, you know,
But I think it goes even deeper than that. I think that I always get the sense from UFC fans that there's this perception that boxing is somehow a more, you know, is not the more macho man of the two, and that UFC's that's a thing for sure.
Well, I think that's a rationalization after the fact,
right?
And
which I think misunderstands the sport.
And the reason for that is that UFC has been much more easily accessed because of Fox showing it live on, and it's been hit or miss. But
don't you think a component of that also is that UFC, all the guys tend to fight each other? It's like one organization. Whereas in boxing, you have, you know, it's more splintered.
But the real thing is all of that, I'm sure, has some effect.
Right.
But the overreaching effect is the fact that they've been on free television and we have been on premium television. Right. That you go into a bar and if they're going to show a UFC fight, it costs them nothing. You know.
But when all their early stuff was all pay-per-view, wasn't it?
No.
Oh, really?
They go once a month on pay-per-view, and look at their numbers now. Their numbers are in the toilet. They're not doing 100,000 a show. They're really not performing.
Really?
But, yes, but on free television, they still do okay, but not as good as we do. Week in, week out, we're showing them, we're eating their lunch.
Who, out of all the guys that you've worked with, and you've worked with so many of the top fighters through the last, you know, whatever it's been, 40, 50 years, who were you closest to personally?
Well, you know, again, I'm closer, I guess, to the older guys because they're closer to my age. But I was close with Marvelous Marvin Hagler. The fighters in nowhere are Tommy and Marvin and Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard. I was very close with Muhammad Ali. Really close, very, very close now with George Foreman, but he's almost a contemporary.
How come he's not, you don't see him doing much boxing punditry anymore?
George, anytime I would ask him to be he'd be happy to. But George is an extraordinarily wealthy man who has a lot of business interests, a lot of charitable interests, and the people who staff the television want younger people involved. In other words, as delightful as George was, they would look to a more contemporary guy like an Andre Ward or a Timothy Bradley or even a Roy Jones to be a commentator.
And what led to the rift between you and De La Hoya? Outside?
Well, there was no real rift. What happened was a guy named Richard Schaefer came in, and he was a banker, and he felt that, unbeknownst to anybody, that he was going to use De La Hoya to put himself in business. And so he had De La Hoya go to break a contract with us on stupid grounds.
So you still had him under contract at that time?
We had him under contract. You see, what happened was, this is before Schaefer, he had a contract with us, and then he had a very good lawyer, and good manager, Mike Hernandez, and they said, look, you're paying him more anyway. Let's go into a new contract that gives him more and so forth. And I said, sure. And we entered into a new contract, and we were unaware because we weren't a California company, that there's a law in California, or there may be a law in California, which was used against us, that you can't have a contract for more than 7 years. So our contract, we had a contract for 4 years, and then we had another contract for 3 years, and then we had another contract for another 4 years, but they were all improved. But there was tacking. They tacked one against the other, and the judge said, we're more than 7 years.
Okay.
Bullshit.
Right.
I mean, we would, I think, won an appeal. Meanwhile, they took De La Hoya away for 2 fights, and Jerry Perenchio, who would own Univision, promoted him. Jerry just passed away. And then they weren't making any money like they were making with us. And so De La Hoya came back, and he had a few more fights with us. And then Schaefer set up his own company and with De La Hoya. And the end result was that a number of years later, when Oscar was in rehab, Schaefer tried to sell the company to feather his own nest to Heyman, and that's when it all blew up. So there was never any real rift, you know.
But certainly a rift in the sense that from a fan's point of view.
He left us. No.
Right, but there was, isn't that kind of what led to like the top-ranked fighters only fight top-ranked guys, Golden Boy guys only fight them?
That was really caused not by Oscar, who in those early days really didn't have much input in his company.
Right.
But with Schaefer, who was, a bad guy. Look what he did with Oscar. I mean, Oscar put him in business, and then he tried to steal the company from Oscar. I mean, not a good man.
Is Oscar more hands-on now?
Yes.
Do you ever mentor him or offer him advice on how?
No, because he's a competitor.
Right.
But and at a certain point, a bird learns how to fly and flies on his own.
Well, when that whole thing went down with Schaefer, I mean, I knew people that were, around that company that thought that De La Hoya wasn't going to last, 6 months. Then he wasn't going to last through the end of the year. Then by spring, he's going to be gone, over and over. And he still somehow manages to be there.
Well, no, more than manages to be there. He has good people with him.
Right.
Eric Gomez is good.
Sure.
Robert Diaz.
So they've done a successful job.
They're good, hardworking people. Oscar knows boxing. They were fortunate that they have this Canelo Alvarez, who's their bell cow. Oscar certainly learned enough from us how to promote. He promotes very well. There's nothing bad I can say about him. So I always assumed that when they got rid of Schaefer, that Oscar would fly on his own, and he has.
Okay, I'm jumping around here for sure, but I forgot, you're a guy that's been around for so long that there's all this stuff I want to get to, and it's not going to necessarily be a clean segue between them. So I want to talk about Floyd Mayweather a little bit, because I know that you were, of course, his early promoter.
Well, we promoted Floyd for 10 and a half years.
Right. I'm wondering if during that time, I just want to talk about that era, his era, or what we would maybe think of as his era, and the impact that he had as a fighter on boxing, which in my view is ultimately going to be very negative for a number of reasons. I'm wondering what it was like when you worked with him, if you ever counseled him, because I think he was essentially a product of marketing, all his talent aside. I mean, he was a boring fighter that nobody cared about up until he fought De La Hoya and Ricky Hatton and all those guys. And I'm wondering if in those early years as a promoter, did you counsel him or caution him about his fight style?
No, because his fight style with us when he was coming up, he wasn't a cautious fighter. He was a very entertaining fighter.
I remember those fights. There were a lot of pretty boring fights of his back then.
I never saw it that way. I thought he was a very good fighter. The one thing I couldn't understand is he was always telling us we were marketing him wrong. And in essence, it was that I wasn't selling him well enough to the African-American market. And that's the disadvantage of age. Sometimes age is an advantage because you have experience, but sometimes it's a disadvantage. And because I was raised and came up with this during the civil rights movement, I knew everybody, Muhammad Ali, the cusp of, that I thought I knew the African American market, but I knew the African American market of the 60s. I didn't know the African American market of the 90s and the aughts. And Floyd did, and I couldn't relate to it. I didn't, you know, these guys, what are they making a fuss of these rap guys? I mean, I couldn't understand it. But Floyd did, and when he left me, he capitalized on it.
When did he leave you? What was his first fight?
It was after he fought. What's the kid's name? Zab Judah.
I think it's really interesting if you look at Floyd Mayweather's boxing record. Sometimes I just like to look at these guys' records. If you look at his, it's not that he never fought anybody, but he really handpicked and moved himself through the divisions that he was in to fight guys that were past their prime.
That was not Floyd.
Well,
that was our matchmakers.
Okay. But beyond your matchmakers when he wasn't working with you.
Well,
I think
when he left and fought Zab Judah, he carefully picked and chose his opponents.
Right.
That's all on him.
I mean, it's fascinating to me. I used to marvel when in the build up to one of his fights, because he's like at the time was one of the only crossover guys. Obviously, Pacquiao would have been another big one. Cotto, there's a few of them. But in the lead up to his fights, I would hear people say stuff that just made no sense to me. Like, oh, it's going to be crazy. Well, why? Why do you think it's going to be crazy? When is a Floyd Mayweather fight ever crazy? Like, has anybody in history ever watched a Floyd Mayweather fight twice?
No, because it was crazy. The fight wasn't crazy. But
it's all the stuff around the fight.
Around the
that's
fight,
crazy.
the people who were coming, and people, the rock stars and the rappers.
I'll tell you a story about the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight. So the night that fight happened, I was playing at our singer's school fundraiser, right? And so we're at this fundraiser, and I'm surrounded by hundreds of people, and they obviously they knew it was a big fight, so they got the pay-per-view on a TV, and everybody's watching the fight. And as they're doing the ring walk and the ring announcement and all that stuff, people are, and I could tell just by listening to people that these are not fight fans, these are casual sports fans or whatever. People are just curious because of the hoopla. And in the lead up to it, people are going, "Oh my God, Mayweather's going to knock him out in the third. No way, man. Pacquiao's going to do that." Blah, blah, all that sort of stuff. And the fight starts, and people are hooting and hollering. And by a few rounds into it, a little less hooting and hollering. By midway through it, people are going, "Fuck these motherfuckers!" And by the end of it, they are angry. They're hostile. Don't you think that? And that's sort of like that's the biggest fight or the biggest example, right? But I felt like that every time I watched a Floyd Mayweather fight.
Yeah,
Don't you think that ultimately when you have people that aren't boxing fans, that you get them to tune in on something and it's that dismal, that ultimately does a disservice to the popularity of the sport?
Well, it sure does. But again, the promoter doesn't have any control over it.
No, I know. I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying, I'm just reflecting on the Mayweather era.
I mean, I had so
as
many,
big as he was, I just think that the guy did more harm than good.
Well, I don't know. I probably, yeah. But, it worked for him, and he made a lot of money, and I can't knock him for that. I mean, I remember when the kid came with us, we got him a car, a SUV, and he's driving around, and he comes up to the office all sweaty and everything. And we said, "Floyd, what's the matter?" He says, "What's the matter? I've been going all over town paying my bills." I said, "Bills?" He says, "Yeah, the telephone company, the electric company." He didn't know you could pay by check. He was going with cash, paying. I mean, he was so naive.
Right.
But, I have a soft spot in my heart still for Floyd. Yeah.
Like on a personal level.
Yeah, I like his father.
I mean, what's it like when you guys are all in? What's it like when you're at one of these fights and Floyd walks by and then Richard Schaefer walks by and Dale? You know what I mean? Like you have to, and Al Heyman's there. Like you must have to deal with these people that publicly you're feuding with for years and years.
Well, with Floyd, we're always face to face, very courteous to each other. With his father, very courteous with his uncles. We're all friends. Well,
Right.
You know, with Schaefer, that's different. I mean, I don't like Schaefer, and if I don't like somebody, I'll say hello and so forth. With Heyman, Heyman's never done anything bad to me, you know? So I have nothing against Heyman. I know what he is and so forth, but I have no trouble talking with him and dealing with him. Schaefer is another. Schaefer is a vicious, in my opinion, a vicious person who has really, for me, no ethics. So I don't say that against my competitors. Oscar is a competitor, but I have no personal animosity towards Oscar.
Sure.
Or DeBella. No personal animosity.
Right.
But there are a few that I really can't stand.
Okay, I posted on my Twitter yesterday that I was going to interview and asked the internet if there was any questions. So just to wrap this up, and then I will get out of your hair because you have been extremely generous with your time today. I'm just going to run a few of these by you. Now, the first one is somebody didn't even really exactly ask a question, but they wanted me to ask you about bad judging in boxing and fixing fights and that whole thing. And we have seen some really horrible decisions in recent years. In your experience, is that because promoters and commissions and stuff are in cahoots with boxing judges, or is that, what is that? Where does that come from?
Okay.
Is there corruption there? That's what I'm trying to ask.
In my opinion, there is no corruption. There is no corruption in the sense that people are taking money to achieve a result, or people are instructed by a commission to reach a certain result. We have some instances of terrible bad judging that hurt the sport.
Who hires the judges?
The judges are hired by the commission.
Okay.
And in the old days, it was the organizations that appointed the judges, and that still happens in some place in the world. But say in Las Vegas, it is Nevada, it's the commission that appoints the judges, and they're pretty dictatorial about it.
But judges know who the A-side fighter is going into this. Do you think that affects their scoring?
I think the whole system is bad. I think what should happen is there should be a pool of 40 or 50 judges and about 10 referees that are selected for all fights. And if any of them screw up, they go out and they bring somebody in. The idea, look what happens in Nevada. In Nevada, while they bring in 1 or 2 sometimes officials from outside, it's Nevada officials, people who live in Nevada. It's a limited pool. And some of them are not able to really judge well. Now, you think it's easy. Sit there and, hey, it's great. Sit there, the best seat in the house at a fight.
No, I actually don't. I think it's really confusing at the fight.
But you gotta pay attention for 3 minutes of each round, and if it's a 12-round fight, and bad judging would be in a 12-round fight because it goes to a decision, that really takes a lot out of you.
And it looks you can be ringside at a fight, and when the fight moves into the other side of the ring, it's hard to tell what's going on.
Okay, but that's why you have judges on different side of the ring. That's not a problem. What's the problem is, particularly when the judge gets older, it's very hard, and I know that for a fact, to concentrate for 3 minutes 12 times in the course of an hour, to really not let your mind wander. Right?
Sure.
These are not robots. These are human beings.
Yeah.
Now, a young guy, it's easier than for an older person. I know that I would have, at my age, knowing what I know about boxing and knowing about blows and so forth, for me to concentrate 12 rounds, 3 minutes a round, would be extraordinarily difficult.
Right.
And until they recognize that, we'll have this problem in boxing. Now, in the NBA or the NFL, they have officials, and they assign them to different games. Obviously, at times, an official is not doing his job. Not because he's a crook, not because of anything. He's trying, but he just can't do the job. And so they replace him, they ease him out, and so forth. That has to be done in boxing. The one thing I am almost 100% sure of is that there is no corruption involved.
Okay, this is my final question. They wanted me to ask you what keeps you going, too, but we kind of talked about that earlier. So, and this is silly here, but somebody wanted me to ask you if you will ever settle your feud with Don King in the ring.
I have no feud with Don King.
Did you guys make
Don King
make
and
him
I
make friends years ago?
With Don King and I are like two warriors that went through wars against each other and now have a grudging respect for each other. That's the truth.
And you could argue that you won that war, considering you're still here and he's not.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he would argue that there were significant periods where he won.
Sure.
And I don't like to put it in winning or losing. I think we just were sort of ended up good for each other because it created a lot of interest, the animosity that we dealt with each other on.
Why isn't he a relevant promoter anymore?
Because
I mean, he's technically not retired, right?
Well, no, because he had a different philosophy from the one I had. My philosophy was that it was business. And in order to run a successful business, you had to always infuse your company with younger people, because younger people were much more aware of things that were happening than an older person, than myself. Whether it was the change in technology, social media, and things like that. I realized that right from the get-go. With Don, he was more oriented to the old-fashioned promoter, the barker. Nobody could do it better than King.
Sure.
To, to focus attention on himself and therefore on the fight. But again, that wasn't keeping up with the world as it was moving. And he never bothered to hire younger people. Or if he did hire younger people, he was the one that still dictated everything. He knew best how to do, and he did know best how to be a barker. But, it moved on from just being a barker.
Sure.
And so he didn't keep up, and his business disappeared, and he's now just with certain fighters. But he still is valuable to bring attention to a match. I mean, for example, he had a fighter named Duran who fought Wilder in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, a complete bum who wasn't in the ring and everything. And you noticed on Saturday of the fight, the New York Times, which doesn't write much about boxing, had a big article, not on the fight, but on King.
Right. Well, it's amazing, too, that, his presence as a boxing promoter is still felt, to the point that this morning at breakfast, when I told my middle son, who's 11 years old, that I was going to interview a famous boxing promoter today, he said, "Oh, is it the guy with the funny hair?"
Yeah.
It's like, no, honey, different guy.
Well, we sort of, continued to feud on because Trump was one of the few people King was one of the few people in boxing that sided very strongly with Trump.
Right.
And, obviously, I detest him and what he stands for, Trump.
You must have had many dealings with him putting fights in his casinos, I'm guessing, over the years.
Total bad person. really bad person. The fact that he's president of the United States makes me ashamed.
I say that the only silver lining to him being president is it really is proof positive that anybody can be president.
That's not a silver lining.
Yeah, it's not a silver enough lining, I know. Anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the Lomachenko fight. I hope he puts an end to Rigondow's long line of boring fights.
Well, you know, that I look for Loma to win that fight and go on to greater glory. I mean, Lomachenko for me is what boxing is all about.
Absolutely. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that was Mr. Bob Arum, legendary boxing promoter, right here on Walking the Floor. Make sure you tune in to ESPN on December 9th to check out the Lomachenko-Rigondeaux fight. It's going to be epic. I believe it's the first time that two-time Olympic gold medalists. Did I say that right? That doesn't really roll off the tongue. Two-time Olympic gold medalists. First time they've ever met in professional boxing. So it's a historic fight. Make sure you check it out. And that's it for this week. If you get bored, make sure you go back, listen to all those old Walking the Floor interviews. They all live right there in the iTunes store. You can get them on our website, walkingthefloor.com. That is it for this week, boys and girls. Adios, amigos!